Right. It's two past. That's traditionally as long as I can wait. So we'll move along with today's session, Wilson Library Research Forum. Really pleased to be able to welcome two former fellows. One who is not very former. Raquel was just in our research room yesterday. Um, Waqia Abdul-Kareem and Raquel Douglas will be talking to us today about the work that they've done here in Wilson Library. Just as a precursor to this, I want to remind people why these fellows are speaking to us today. One of the things that Wilson Library is pleased to be able to offer are research fellowships to researchers who are doing really interesting work on predominantly, at least in this instance, Southern history and Southern studies. Um, they both were recipients of a Southern Studies doctoral research fellowship, which funded them for a month to come here and use our collections in a deep way that not everybody is afforded the opportunity to do. The way this is going to work today is at the end of the program, for those of you that are attending this for credit, there will be a QR code that you can scan. In terms of structure, we're going to have two speakers, obviously, and they're going to talk for about a half hour each. And then after the end of that, we'll come back together for some questions. And I would encourage all audience members to either raise their hand or type in the chat something that occurs to them that they would like us to address that isn't being directly addressed in the conversations that we're having. So please feel welcome to do that. Our first speaker today is Waqia Abdul-Kareem, and they were kind enough to send me a bio, is an interdisciplinary scholar and multidisciplinary artist pursuing a doctorate in American Studies at the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University. Their work spans scholarly research, art, and education, with positions at the Museum of Modern Art and the New York Historical Society, and a background in urban agriculture and food justice. Residencies and fellowships include the Colby Summer Institute in Environmental Humanities, the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council's Artist Residency on Governor's Island, the Summer Urban Humanities Fellowship at the Black Gotham Experience, and the Southern Studies Doctoral Fellowship at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Their artistic work has been exhibited at the Hirshhorn Museum, the Abrams Art Center, Movement Research, and the Baltimore Museum of Art. Waqia, welcome. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here, and thank you for the introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. And then I'm going to share my slides, make sure that, and is it sharing? Okay.
They are as intended.
Great. Okay. So I will start. So the title of this presentation is Ecological Dispossession and the Commodification of Land, the Legacy of Enslaved Labor and Environmental Transformation in the South Carolina Lowcountry. So first I want to start by thanking you for the opportunity to share the results of my fellowship month at Wilson Library, and specifically thanking the library staff for their generous support and assistance throughout my fellowship time. So my scholarly work theorizes the co-constitution of environmental extraction and racial violence as foundational to Western modernity, with particular attention to how Black peoples have generated radical ecological alternatives within and against these conditions. It is organized around two interconnected analytical moves. First, I examined how regimes of land seizure, resource exploitation, and racialized violence have operated in concert to shape both landscape and social order, offering a case study for understanding how racial capitalism establishes and maintains Western dominance through the manufacturing of environments. Second, I analyzed practices of power from below, attending to the radical ecological alternatives Black peoples have cultivated amid and in opposition to these extractive regimes. Through this dual focus on the operations of power and the generative forms of resistance and world-making they produce, the dissertation intervenes in debates on racial capitalism, the Anthropocene, and climate justice across Black studies, environmental humanities, history, and anthropology. My month of archival research at UNC was essential to grounding what was previously a largely theoretical project in the material evidence it needed to make its arguments with real a largely theoretical project in the material evidence it needed to make its arguments with real historical force. Today, I want to take you through what I found, what it means for my dissertation's architecture, and what it taught me, not just about the past, but about the very act of archival research itself. Okay. So here's an overview. I'll move through 6 areas today. I'll begin by orienting you to the project's research, context, and theoretical framework, then take you through my findings related to 2 dissertation chapters I've been able to outline as a direct result of this fellowship. I'll then turn to something that surprised me, what I came to think of as the archive itself as an ecosystem with its own politics of space and access. I'll close with the methodological implications of all of this. My aim is to show you not just what documents I examined, but how they changed my thinking, and how the experience of working in Wilson's Library's Southern Historical Collection transformed my sense of what the dissertation needs to do. The central question animating my dissertation is, how did property, racial, scientific, and environmental regimes operate not in parallel, but in active coordination to establish and maintain the plantation economies of the colonial and antebellum South and the racial capitalism economies of the present? This question puts racial capitalism at the center. My argument is that establishing plantation economies required the simultaneous operation of at least 4 intertwined axes: the appropriation of indigenous land and the exploitation of enslaved labor, the extraction of knowledge and resources from both indigenous and African peoples, the subjugation of Black bodies and control over land through spatial enclosure, and what I term ecological dispossession, the mutual alienation of racialized peoples and the more than human world, a process that renders each increasingly hostile to the other in service of capital accumulation. What the Wilson Library collections have helped me see is that these 4 registers were not merely concurrent, but mutually constitutive, each enabling and reinforcing the other through specific material practices that left legible traces in the archive. My theoretical framework understands racial capitalism as operating through 4 interlocking registers, each generating its own distinct sites of materialization. Property, produced through land grants, deeds, indentures, and the philosophical texts that justify them. Science, emerging through correspondence, agricultural society records, and botanical and medical documents. Environment made legible through plantation management records, maps, engineering and geological surveys, agricultural transformation documents, and later through environmental reports and studies. And this is the insight the fellowship made newly visible: the archive itself as a 4th site, the way these documents are collectively granted officialness, organized, preserved, and made accessible is not neutral infrastructure, but a continuation of the power relations they document. So let me briefly inventory the major collections I work with. The Elliott and Gonzalez family papers, spanning across 2 centuries from 1701 to 1898, were perhaps the most generative. They gave me intimate access to how major plantation families conceived of their enterprise at every level, from philosophical justification down to daily operational calculation. The Bull family papers provided a fascinating companion, particularly in their revealing account books and correspondence. For my chapter on speculative foundations, the South Carolina deeds and the Henry Livingston indenture were indispensable. They showed me exactly how the philosophical frameworks translated into legal practice on the ground. I also had the opportunity to examine early scientific documents, particularly those of the Agricultural Society of South Carolina, including an 1879 lecture by the mineralogist Charles Upsham Shepherd titled South Carolina Phosphates, delivered before the Society on the rich phosphate deposits of the Lowcountry, their geological elemental significance, and their economic potential. I want to turn now to my first chapter, Speculative Foundations, which asks a question that sounds almost paradoxical. If private property is the basis of modern liberal political economy, how was it itself constructed? My argument is that property cannot be understood as a stable legal category that was then applied to land and labor. Rather, property as an abstract concept was materialized through the very practices of dispossession and commodification I am examining. The Wilson Library materials gave me the archival grounding to make this argument in a way that theoretical scholarship alone could not. And I'm just going to sort of point out here that I have two documents that I'm showing, and one is it's the first page of the Fundamental Constitution by John Locke and Ashley Cooper, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. And the other one is one of the indentures that I took a scan of. And I'm also going to go into kind of give you a little sort of more information about that briefly. Before turning to my archival findings, I want to begin with the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, the point of departure for my first chapter. It is a remarkable document precisely because of its contradictions. John Locke, the philosopher most associated with grounding political authority and natural rights and property, co-drafted it with Anthony Ashley Cooper, one of the founding proprietors of South Carolina. Though never officially ratified, it provided a utopian blueprint whose ideas would go on to shape modern property relations, calling for a feudal social hierarchy of landgraves and caciques, enshrining the absolute power of enslavers over the enslaved as property relation, and advancing principles of religious toleration. They are not incidental tensions, they are constitutive of the liberal project. Reading this document alongside the deeds and indentures that translated it into legal practice on the ground made visible something crucial. The philosophical framework was not applied to reality. It was produced through these legal instruments in response to specific material conditions and resistances. Locke's philosophy didn't create colonial Carolina. Colonial Carolina's legal necessities helped shape what we now call Lockean liberalism. This brings me to what I take to be the central theoretical contribution of this chapter. Property is not a fixed legal category, but an ongoing practice of dispossession. The word speculative in my chapter title is doing double work. It points to the financial speculation inherent in colonial land acquisition, but it also points to the philosophical speculation, the conceptual construction that gave this acquisition its legitimacy. The legal instruments I examine are fascinatingly adaptive. They evolved over time from elaborate, materially grounded forms to increasingly streamlined official documents, but always in direct response to historical pressures and resistances. Specifically, the use of indentures as grants and releases, or lease and releases, was a sophisticated legal technology that began as what the French theorist Michel Foucault called an illegalism, a practice that operates outside or against the law, tolerated or exploited by those with power precisely because it serves their interests, designed to enable landholders to acquire property without paying quitrents or land taxes to colonial governments. This wasn't property law being applied, it was property law being invented in real time. And crucially, this invention happened by positioning both indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans as prior to and exterior to the property relations being constructed, as pre-political beings whose prior claims had no legal standing within the emerging framework. But this positioning was never simply imposed, it was constantly contested. The archive reveals that property law was being innovated precisely because it met with persistent refusal. And just to kind of go back, a note on those indentured. So the indentured is actually the legal form. And if you notice the image that I showed, it had like, it had these indents on them. That's where the term comes from. And then in that case, I'm pointing specifically to sort of the lease and release, which was a specific conveying technique that involved a two-step method. So the leasing of land, and then shortly thereafter, the full release of the title to the buyer. And it was used to transfer land granted while avoiding certain legal formalities and fees. And that's what I mean when I call it like an illegalism. And this is important because it comes to replace, what I noticed in my research was that it came to replace the land grant system itself, right? So you sort of start, South Carolina as a proprietary colony starts with these land grants. And then as time moves on, you start to notice in the archive an overwhelming amount of these indentures as a way of kind of transferring land over to others. The Elliott and Gonzalez family papers, the South Carolina deeds, and the Livingston indenture allowed me to trace 5 axes of dispossession, each developed in detail in this chapter. The colonial legal instruments were precision tools, not blunt seizures, but carefully constructed mechanisms. They circumvented financial obligations to governing authorities while creating enforceable claims. Over time, they moved from elaborate material forms toward more streamlined official documents, but always in response to the specific challenges they encountered. Indigenous presence was rendered legally invisible, not by ignoring it, but by constructing a legal framework in which it could not appear as a valid claim. And African enslaved labor was embedded into the very definition of property from the outset, not added to pre-existing property, to a pre-existing property concept, but built into its foundation. My second chapter, Plantation Intensification and Swamp Refusal, takes up this question of what happened once this legal and philosophical infrastructure was in place. How did plantation owners actually attempt to transform this land and these people into calculable, manageable, productive units? And this is the question the archive forced me to take seriously, albeit through a sideways reading of its materials. How did they consistently run up against failure? The word refusals in my title is central. Both the enslaved people laboring on these plantations and the more than human world of swamps, rivers, weather, and disease repeatedly refused to behave as the ledgers demanded. This chapter is about both the attempt to impose order and the persistent impossibility of that project. The Plantation Family Papers gave me intimate access to how the calculating logic of the plantation operated in practice. The account books and management records in the Elliott, Gonzalez, and Bull papers are documents of a particular kind of fantasy, the fantasy that human beings and ecological systems can be rendered into predictable, manageable units through sufficient documentation and calculation. What's striking is the dual nature of these records. On the one side, meticulous attention to numbers, accounting, and documentation, the compulsing recording of labor, time, materials, and bodies. On the other side, the constant intrusion of everything that wouldn't be calculated. People running away, crops destroyed by hurricanes, boats capsized in turbulent waters, enslaved people and enslavers alike killed by the diseases thriving in the very swampy environments the plantation was built to transform. The ledgers registers both the attempt at control and its failure. Reading them, you begin to see the plantation not as a successfully controlled space, but as a site of perpetual crisis management, requiring constant vigilance, adaptation, and escalating violence precisely because the project of control was never complete. What I came to call swamp refusals encompasses two distinct but related phenomena. First, there is human refusal, the acts of resistance by enslaved people running away, working slowly, direct confrontation, sabotage that appear in the archive as disruptions, as entries that break the accounting logic. The obsessiveness with which plantation owners documented these disruptions is itself telling. The very compulsiveness of the accounting, the driven need to record every loss, every failure, every act of resistance testifies to the fundamental instability of the regime. Second, there's what I call more than human refusal. The swamps, storms, disease vectors, rivers, and ecologies that refuse to be domesticated by the plantation's logic. These aren't mere background conditions. They were active forces that shaped plantation operations and that enslaved people understood and navigated in ways that enslavers often did not. The archive reveals enslaved people's environmental knowledge as a form of power and resistance that the ledgers could only register as disruption. Together, these two forms of refusal fundamentally transform how I understand the plantation. It was not a space of successful domination, but one of perpetual generative instability. I want to turn now to something that became as analytically important to me as the documents themselves. The archive as an ecosystem, as a material, spatial, and political environment that actively shapes the knowledge produced within it. I want to be precise about what I mean. I'm not simply making the by now familiar point that archives are not neutral repositories. I'm making a more specific claim about how working in a specific archive, Wilson Library's Southern Historical Collection, revealed the continuing material effects of historical power relations in the moment of research, in the present moment of research. Archival research is a sensory and embodied practice in ways that scholarly writing rarely captures. I felt the weight of 18th century paper. I inhaled the particular smell of plantation leisures, organic decay, compressed time. I performed the delicate physical labor of turning pages that had not been turned in decades, that were fragile enough to require the specific slow movement archival work demands. The sensory dimensions are not incidental. They are part of how the past materializes in the present, how research becomes more than the recovery of information and becomes instead an encounter with the physical traces of historical life. The scholar's body is in the archives too, and that presence shapes what they can know and how they come to know it. This understanding of embodied archival research is now central to my methodological approach, and it's one of the ways this fellowship has genuinely transformed my project, not just in adding historical evidence, but in changing how I understand the practice of historical scholarship itself. The most striking observation I made at Wilson Library and during my longer time at the South Carolina Historical Society, the College of Charleston Special Collections, and the Avery Research Center, all here in South Carolina, came not from the documents themselves, but from watching the reading room. White genealogists tracing connections to wealthy planter families moved through the archive with confidence. The cataloging systems were organized to serve them. Collections named after plantation families, finding aids structured around slaveholder lineages. They moved directly from catalog to box, found what they needed, and left efficiently. What I came to think of as analytically significant was a noticeable absence of Black genealogists seeking enslaved ancestors, and when they were present, the difficulties they encountered locating what they were looking for, difficulties some shared with me directly during lunch breaks. The archive is not simply silent about familial histories of enslaved people, though it largely is. The structural point is more profound. The archive's organizing logic was built to track planter lineages, which means that finding enslaved people in these records requires an entirely different kind of reading and methodological approach. I came to think of the reading room as having affective geographies, patterns of ease and friction, confidence and uncertainty that map directly onto racialized histories of who the archive was designed to serve. The physical space reinforces these dynamics in ways both obvious and subtle. Portraits of white donors hang on the walls. Architectural choices evoke a particular Southern heritage. The very atmosphere of the space signals who history is valued, whose presence was anticipated when the archive was built, whose research needs were kept in mind when collections were organized and finding aids were written. My own navigation of the archive, the tentative movements, the lateral searching, the need to read every document that wasn't meant to document what I was looking for, was itself a reenactment in miniature of the erasures of the archive documents. The friction of my research was not incidental, it was evidence. These observations have crystallized into a methodological framework I've come to call muck flooding, one I believe is among the more original contributions of this project. Just as enslaved people navigated wetlands transformed into plantation landscapes designed to control their movement, finding within them cooperative sites of refusal and resistance alongside the more than human world, this project navigates the archival landscape by following the logic of the wetland itself. Never static, always metabolic, responsive to what it cannot contain. Wetlands don't move linearly. They submerge, surface, transform, and redistribute. Muck flooding mirrors this dynamic across three methodological commitments. First, sources as ecosystems, integrating plantation records, land deeds, and scientific and agricultural texts with ethnographic engagement that treats Black people and wetlands as active participants, not objects of study, but co-producers of knowledge. Second, surfacing through rupture, interrupting linear chronology through shifts in voice and sensory mode, using ethnography of people in place to flood the archive and redistribute what erasure has submerged. Third, affective rhythm, attending to the melancholic stases of archival research, the muck, and the violent but necessary overwhelm of rupture that surfaces new knowledge forms, the flood. The friction that Black researchers encounter in archives like Wilson Library is not incidental. It materializes in the presence the very erasures that slaveholders enacted through their record-keeping practices. And it's precisely that friction that muck flooding is designed to navigate and transform into method. So let me turn briefly to where the project stands structurally. I came into this fellowship with a theoretical framework and some preliminary archival work. I'm leading with detailed outlines for all 4 chapters, 2 of which were significantly developed through this fellowship, and a methodological framework that has grown more rigorous and historically grounded. So chapter 1, speculative foundations, and chapter 2, plantation intensification and swamp refusals, are fully outlined and ready for drafting. The former excavating the 1669 fundamental constitutions as a speculative blueprint for racial capitalism, the latter tracing how planters' projects of environmental and corporal control consistently met their limits in the resistance of enslaved and maroon peoples working alongside wetland ecologies. Chapter 3, War, Reconstruction, and Extractive Transformation, is an active development, drawing on the Agricultural Society records and scientific correspondence I examined here, tracing the post-Civil War collision between Black visions of freedom and the extractive logics of phosphate mining and industrial agriculture. Chapter 4, Contemporary Dispossession and Persistent Counter-Ecology, remains in earlier stages of development, pending further ethnographic research that I'm currently doing, examining how conservation, real estate development, and climate disaster, the accumulated violences of previous chapters returning to haunt the present, continue to function as terraforming projects displacing Gullah Geechee communities, while counter-ecologies of collective stewardship and wetland restoration persist and evolve. Now, move to conclusion. So just as in, first of all, I want to kind of point out, this is sort of the title of my, I think it's going to be the title of my dissertation, Ecological Dispossession and Counter-Ecologies in the South Carolina Lowcountry. And both of those are sort of, I sort of talked about ecological dispossession a bit. I can talk about counter-ecologies more if you like during the Q&A. So just as enslaved people navigated plantation landscapes designed to control their movement, finding within them cooperative sites of refusal and resistance alongside the land itself, researchers recovering humanitarian histories must navigate archival landscapes organized around dominant narratives, finding generative sites of methodological collaboration to read against the grain. The archive is not a neutral repository, but a metabolic site, continuously processing, absorbing, and expelling, where historical power relations shape whose stories can be told and what labor that telling requires. The month I spent at UNC was essential to transforming this project from a theoretical intervention into a historically grounded analysis, one that attends not only to past processes, but to the contemporary reverberations in the very spaces where we research them. The collections gave me archival depth. The experience of working in that ecosystem gave me something more, a fourth register of the argument, the archive itself as active site, the methodological framework of mock flooding, and a new understanding of knowledge institutions as continuations of the power relations they document. My dissertation now asks not only how racial capitalism was built through legal, scientific, and environmental regimes in the colonial and antebellum South, but how it continues to structure the knowledge institutions through which we try to understand that history. That is a harder and more important question, and one I could not have formulated with this clarity without the fellowship. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very much looking forward to discussion. I think there'll be some good questions. In fact, I was thinking we might need to invite you to Wilson Hall staff to have a conversation with us. So we're going to move on to our second speaker today. And my second speaker is Raquel Douglas. She is a plant-loving, multimedia artist, wellness practitioner, and herbalist in training with roots in Houston, Texas. She's currently a sociology PhD candidate at Brown University. She's doing fieldwork and oral history interviews with Black farmers in North Carolina. A budding farmer in her own right, she spent the last 3 years growing veggies and medicinal herbs on collectively stewarded Black-owned farms. She recently relocated full-time to Durham in order to cultivate a communal land stewardship project with Black women and non-binary folk. When she's not researching, spending time in nature, or writing, she enjoys creating community events and sharing holistic wellness products. She is deeply shaped by Yoruba cosmologies. Recently, she's felt indebted to the medicines of Angelica, Blue Varium, Hyacinth, Bees, and Loving Community. I'm sorry about the mispronunciations. Welcome, Raquel. I'm very happy
Hi,
to have you.
thank you. Hearing you talk, I realize there's a lot of uncommon words in my bio.
Well,
So
maybe just uncommon to me. I don't know that I'm necessarily representative of much.
that's okay. Um, hey y'all. My name is Raquel. I am still in the midst of my archival research. The bulk of my project is based on oral history interviews, and so um, I'm still trying to figure out specifically how I want to incorporate the archival research into my dissertation. So I figured that the thing that would be most helpful for me today is to talk through with you all sort of like broadly what my project is and how I came into the archive and what that sort of journey has been like and how my thinking has evolved. I also think sometimes it's helpful to hear those types of talks for maybe undergrads who haven't seen the process of doing research. So I'm, trying to peel back the veil. But what that means is I'll be talking rather than sharing a presentation. So very broadly, my dissertation, as Mr. Turry said, conducting oral histories of Black farmers in North Carolina, specifically in order to understand the sort of worldview and values and practices that shapes the way that they engage with their community. Said differently, I'm interested in how Black farmers understand the social, political, and cultural significance of their agricultural and community-based work. Most of the Black farmers I engage with are doing a lot more than simply planting seeds, harvesting, and selling it for profit. They're deeply intertwined with activism, social justice struggles, community-based work, and in chasing, different sort of visions and dreams for what they want their community to be. And so my dissertation seeks to tease through some of that worldview and how, what are those values, what are those practices, and how does that map onto their ongoing resistance against structural oppression, their how that worldview maps onto their ongoing struggles against land theft, against food apartheid, and environmental injustices. Um, and some of the central sort of values and practices that come up in that work is, of course, ongoing resistance and a responsibility to continue this longstanding struggle, a commitment to building sovereignty for themselves and their communities, practices and values around cooperation, and a deep spiritual and religious mandate for their community and land-based work. I refer to this sort of like larger worldview as, a Black agrarian soul. And I can talk more about like what that concept means in the Q&A, just because I want to make sure I get time to the UNC things. Um, but really what I was interested in, very broadly speaking, there's a lot of scholarship that already exists that talks about how the way that Black Americans, especially Black rural Southern folk, engage with land is deeply shaped by, histories of slavery and sharecropping and dispossession and the need to resist. And so part of, as I'm doing all these oral history reviews to sort of like understand these individual journeys into the work and how they're understanding the significance of their work and how this is mapping onto their community-based work and their agricultural practices, I entered into the archives in order to understand, what were the sort of historical and structural contexts that shaped how we got to where we are today. Um, and so I went into the archive with a very big vision, like to trace the evolution of, these conditions that have shaped the ways that Black folks relate to land in North Carolina, from slavery and marriage to sharecropping and the flight from farming to land acquisition and land loss. And I'm a sociologist, I'm not a historian by training, so forgive me. I quickly realized that that was a very large goal, and much bigger than what most folks enter the archives with. But I began looking at a lot of studies and reports on sharecropping and Black farmers, theses on Black land laws, periodicals on Black cooperatives, a lot of work on racial violence, and some things about food system in North Carolina and articles on slavery and things like that. And I'm still in the process of weaving that broad historical narrative together with specific details. But for the most part, it's a familiar story for anyone who's studied US history or the history of Black farming in the South. We get dispossession of indigenous people, the stealing of land, slavery, sharecropping, land acquisition, land loss. And it's an important story that needs to be retold. It's not the focus of my talk today. What I want to focus on today is, in the process of doing research and in talking to archivists, I learned about Soul City and Tillery, which are two very exceptional case studies that exemplify both the structural conditions that shaped how Black, folks related to land, the structures they were up against, the challenges they were met, the sort of like violences and discriminations that they had to go through, as well as the sort of like broader dreams and desires and values that shaped how they wanted to engage with that land. I'm still in the process of doing the research on Soul City. But just very broadly, Soul City was the freedom dream of a lawyer named Floyd McKissick, who was a very prominent and active civil rights attorney and freedom fighter in the 60s and 70s. And he had a vision of creating a town out in Warren County that would be free of racism. And there was a lot of work that he went into in order to like build the infrastructure for that, get a lot of federal grants for that. And there are reasons why that project did not go through that I'm still exploring in the archives. But today I want to focus on Tillery, which is another one of these exceptional cases. And Tillery, well, I guess I'll just start the talk about Tillery. So the land that's currently known as the Tillery Resettlement Project is the ancestral homelands of the Tuscarora people. These were indigenous stewards of this area who were violently displaced and experienced genocide with European settlers and colonists coming over. And during colonial times, the King of Eland started giving away land that were historically stewarded by the Tuscarora to white settlers. And there's a specific area out in eastern North Carolina that was signed over to the Tillery family from Scotland. They turned this land into a plantation and enslaved Africans on the same land that was stolen from indigenous people. After emancipation, many of the formerly enslaved people in this area became sharecroppers, just like in most other folks of the South. Sharecropping became a new form of slavery that a new form of slavery that kept Black folks and some white folks indebted into the land, where theoretically they were supposed to the landowner was supposed to furnish all the equipment and the land, and the sharecropper was supposed to furnish all of the labor. And at the end of the season, they would split the profits from the harvest. But during the season, the sharecropper would often borrow money from the landowner for food or for different materials and things like that. And it would always come up that no matter how fruitful the harvest was, the cropper always came out in debt. And so it kept them, and it was often called a new form of slavery. And so sharecroppers were just like, by and large, some of the most impoverished folks living in the South. And during the Great Depression, this only becomes worse. And so there's a large amount of an increasing number of sharecroppers who are applying for government aid during the Great Depression. And so the Roosevelt administration tried according to the Roosevelt administration, they were trying to think of ways to help provide sharecroppers with a path to land ownership and self-sufficiency. And so from the government's framework, this was a way for them to be sort of benevolent and help with like the uplift of these people. And so they developed the resettlement program, which created about 113 different resettlements throughout the US, mostly in rural areas, that provided everything a community would need to be self-sufficient, including, um, schools, different share, community centers, bathrooms, chicken coops, and so much more. And so from the government point of view, it was like this benevolent, like poverty alleviation program. However, Tillery residents don't see it that way. They see it as, you know, many of them talk about how in the early to mid 20th century, a lot of sharecroppers migrated away from the South to escape those cycles of exploitation and debt peonage and racial violence. And this posed the existential threat to white landowners who had become dependent on free exploited labor. And so some in the oral histories with folks from Tillery, they state that they believe that the government created the resettlement program in order to bail out white landowners who were losing money due to that out migration. Both are likely true, to different extent. But regardless, the government purchased these large tracts of land, 113 in total, 13 of which were designated specifically for Black communities. There were 3 resettlement projects in North Carolina, one that was specifically for Indigenous folks, one that was specifically for white folks, and then Tillery, which had both a Black and white section, and it was the only one of the government tracts that had both. So as I mentioned before, the resettlement community provided residents with all the infrastructure that most of the infrastructure that they needed to cultivate a robust, self-sustaining community, which was a very sharp contrast from the experiences of sharecropping families. Every farm came with a house, a chicken coop, a barn, an outdoor toilet, and an orchard. The community itself had a school, a community store, and a community center and a cooperative store. One of the resettlers, Miss Dolores Harvey Amison, remembers that her parents felt like they had died and gone to heaven. You take someone who is digging in what they know is going to be their own garden, who is chopping and plowing in what they know is going to be their own field. And for those who had dreamed of being independent, they thought they had died and gone to heaven. And so in this quote, we sort of see that like land ownership felt like heaven for them because not having control over their land and their sources of food was very vital to the oppression of Black folks in the rural South in this time. Sharecroppers dreamed of freedom from this neo-slavery, and land ownership likely felt like one of the only ways to do that while continuing to be able to live off the land. It like that vision of like, I'm doing this for my own self, that's not something that was feasible under the system of sharecropping to the same extent. Another settler, Miss Hazel Battle Hendricks, says it was better than sharecropping because we were supposed to be there permanent. We was farming to own this place and have a home. Likewise, another one says, I enjoyed the house because it made you feel like you were somebody, raising everything and being independent. What I mean by independent, I heard them talking about sharecropping, but I don't know about that. They say you always felt underneath. You didn't feel on top, but down here made you feel like you was doing something for yourself to own something. As these two women show, the resettlement program provided Black communities with an opportunity that had been denied or felt impossible for so many generations before, some type of stability or ownership or something to call their own. They felt like they could no longer be tossed aside when they were no longer useful because there was so much disposability politics embedded within sharecropping. No longer would they have to bounce from farm to farm. Like this was a way for them to, quote, have a home and a sense of ownership, not just over the land, but also over themselves, their livelihoods. And as I'll talk about a little bit later, their political activity, their ability to educate their children, and more. This opportunity to have ownership also engendered a sense of like pride and steadfastness. One resettler remembers growing up picking cotton in fields that her family owned when elders broke out into an old hymn. One person started singing, I Shall Not, and everybody else followed. I'm not going to sing because, I don't think y'all want to hear me sing, but I shall not be moved, just like the tree that's planted in the water. I shall not be moved. We shall not. And then it continues. She says she didn't understand the significance of the hymn at the moment, but looking back, she believes it represented their determination to continue in the face of adversity. The resettlement communities, like the other contemporary research, were able to build a robust community that, was built on cooperatives, cultural events and fellowships. They shared equipment. They helped each other out on their farms. They hosted a range of cultural events. They cultivated their own community markets where they would not be subjected to the high and discriminatory interest rates that they would have received in town. As one resident remembers, the whole piece was about working together to improve your individual life. And that carried over as people came into this community. And it carried over and carried over until it continues today. However, this is America. And so racism and other forms of discrimination were embedded within the program from the very beginning. Sorry, this thing keeps moving. There it goes. Of the 113 government tracks, like I mentioned, Tillery was the only one that had a white and a black section. And because of that, we can see very clearly the Black and white communities received very different infrastructures and size plots. Homes in the white sections had indoor bathrooms, profitable tobacco allotments, and they were given 65 to 85 acres apiece, whereas homes in the Black communities cost 25% more per acre, did not include an indoor bathroom, had no tobacco allotments, and were about 20 acres smaller on average, even though they cost 25% more. As well, a lot of federal documentation on the resettlement program focuses on, like I said, this sort of like idea of the federal government as this benevolent purveyor, like, oh, we're helping these poor sharecroppers get land ownership, and in the process suppresses the role that a lot of like black land grant colleges, extension agents, and Black communities played sort of in the creation and implementation of the program. As well, again, intense, this resettlement community happened in the context of the Jim Crow South. And so residents continue to experience intense levels of discrimination and segregation. Like it wasn't a full bubble against that. Again, sort of referencing the way that it was the only community that was both white and Black. What we see is that originally there were two sections, both and relatively in the same area. But at some point, white residents realized that they were living on a floodplain, and so they wrote the government, and the government moved all of the white residents to like they bought new land for the resettlement program, moved all the white residents to that higher land, and then sold the plots that were in that floodplain to other Black folks, as like a blatant act of environmental racism and disposability politics, where it's like, we're going to make sure that these white folks aren't in this environmentally vulnerable area, but we'll still sell this land to Black folks. Later on, this would prove to be catastrophic. And so it's in particular in 1940, Black farmers, by that point, because I don't think I said the program started in 1934, 1935. By 1940, farmers occupied every parcel of that area until a hurricane came through and broke the Roanoke Dam. While the hurricane was happening, there were 103 farm families that were in the process of purchasing at that time, and 93 of those families lost everything they owned. The Roanoke Rapids Herald estimated that the damage to be $1 million in 1940 dollars. And a lot of the residents remember that many of the people lost interest in living in the resettlement community after losing the crop that year. as well. Again, just continuing to talk through the ways that racism was embedded within this program from the beginning. Like I said, when the program was first created, it was supposed to be a way for sharecropping families to have a pathway to ownership. In reality, many of those early residents experienced it as a form of sharecropping for the government. Um, Former sharecropping families, many of whom were very experienced farmers, had to lease the land from the government and prove to government agents that they knew how to grow and manage the land. White families did not have to go through this. And this resulted in a lot of invasive practices where homes were inspected, people's children were asked questions about, how they like to farm, and they gave families like a 2 to 3 year trial, and if they didn't grow or meet their expectations in their years, then they were sort of put out. This changed once the program was reorganized under the Farmers Home Administration, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But as I mentioned, this program was originally experienced as a form of, quote, sharecropping for the government, end quote, by residents. There were also some sort of inter-community tensions between the Black community that was already there and the sharecropping families that were already there, and the more sort of like wealthy and upwardly mobile community, like Black community that moved in after the restructuring, that I can sort of get into if people are interested in. Just like the differences and the tensions between those. But generally, land ownership and the robust community that resellers were able to build and the infrastructure that they had access to allowed them to sustain their own livelihood, providing the basis for their organizing and activism. According to the concerned citizens of Tillery, quote, our resettlement on our own land and the independence that resulted from it have allowed us to build a strong community base for activism that continues to this day. In spite of the many threats that they received and the violent backlash that many of them experienced as a result of their activism, Tillery resellers were politically active and integral to civil rights and social justice struggles throughout the 20th century, including local desegregation, voting rights, legal and grassroots struggles against Black land loss, and environmental racism. This protection, was somewhat limited, like I said, because they did live in the Jim Crow South. And something that I found really interesting was, as many of us may remember, time and time again in American history, periods of racial and social progress have been followed by racist and reactive backlashes that manifested as conservative political and economic changes, as well as a rise in racist violence. And so in particular, for example, after Emancipation and Reconstruction came an uptick in lynching, sharecropping, and Jim Crow segregation. There was a similar backlash after, at the turn of the 20th century, we see Black Americans, primarily through their own grit and hard work, amass over 15 million acres of land. The resettlement program created an additional option for Black ownership, but it was a drop in the bucket compared to what Black folks were able to cultivate on their own. This land accumulation was a threat to the Southern economy that was based on exploiting Black labor and white social and political structures. As Fannie Lou Hamer would later teach us, it's harder to control a person's vote or their political activity, or, and more, when you don't control their food or their income. And so this accumulation of Black land ownership was a threat to racist and Eurocentric ideas, which I think Waqia beautifully demonstrated at the beginning of their talk, that primarily treated Black folks as property, which dehumanized Black people and which equated land ownership with power. And so shortly after the resettlement program began, the relatively liberal and socially oriented resettlement administration was replaced by the Farmers Home Administration in around 1940, which was much more conservative and was based on more restrictive supervised loans. The Farmers Home Administration no longer funded community events and resettlements, ended the restriction on only local Black people being able to buy land in the community. And it turned decision-making powers about loans, foreclosures, how people were able to use loan funds, and when people would be able to receive these funds over to local county agents who were mostly large, wealthy white landowners. Black folks experienced violence, discrimination, and other forms of disenfranchisement relative to white farmers under the system. And county level agents and other FMHA practices are directly implicated in untold numbers of Black land theft and dispossession across the country, including Tillery. Resettlers remember, federal agents arriving at their parents' homes and giving them 30 minutes to move everything out. One child of second generation resellers was only able to save her family's home because she happened to be in the area and she had connections to local radio stations and could get got a helicopter from Raleigh circling over their home in less than an hour, causing those federal agents to leave. And instances like this spurred a lot of sort of activism in Tillery around land loss and land theft and led to them playing an integral role in the Pigford lawsuit. I'm noticing the time, and so I'm just going to skip a little bit. Some of the other things I wanted to talk through were some of the ways that we see the complexity of land loss through looking at the experiences in Tillery, through looking at discrimination, the impact of mechanization on farms, but also like the ways that some folks willingly and eagerly left the rural South and left land as a way to escape, the sort of like backbreaking labor, the unstable income, the proximity to, white Southern vigilante violence and the such. And so in conclusion, there's a few things that I find really interesting for my broader project based from Tillery. One is understanding that what land ownership means for Black communities is deeply shaped by historical and ongoing experiences of slavery, sharecropping, discrimination, and land theft, which is already clear in the literature. But in particular, like land ownership provided Tillery resellers with the ability to be relatively more self-determined and to build robust, interconnected community networks. That was the basis of their cultural practices, activism, and cooperation. I've only just scratched the surface in Tillery. I have so much more to learn about the experiences of like sharecropping families and how other members of the community experienced what happened in that space. But two, Tillery really exemplifies that access to land is not enough to resolve the deep racial injustices and structural oppressions within this country. Tillery is exceptional in that in Black resettlement communities in general, about 60 to 70% of those families still own that land. And that level of retention is unheard of in the South. And yet there's still so much of this history and so much of this vulnerability and dispossession that happened. Access to land and economic resources certainly create more opportunities for Black communities to build more self-determination, but there's a limit to what this can grow into so long as the structural and social conditions remain. We are currently living in a moment of conservative backlash against racial and social progress. And the only way to sort of like resolve these underlying issues is we actually need to sort of undergo some large scale transformations that will break this sort of back and forth cycle of social progress, conservative backlash. And then finally, something else we learned in Tillery is that communities that have the, infrastructure, the resources and the relationships that are necessary to build self-reliance are relatively more resilient, have a stronger foundation upon which to protest and protect themselves, and can be more self-determined. And so I find some solace in the fact that we are also in a moment where folks are building community-based networks of self-reliance that can create little bubbles of protection, even if they are not perfect, even if they are not foolproof, even if they are not the solution to everything. We are in a moment where a lot of folks are organizing around sets of values and practices that run counter to the prevailing logic of patriarchal racial capitalism. and thinking about how these smaller networks and worldviews are embedded in them are what we need to move forward, and how those networks can provide us a stronger foundation upon which we organize and build. And those three things are helping me frame how I'm shaping this overall project and why it's important to think through the sort of like worldview and practices and community-based networks of self-reliance that Black farmers are building today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Um, so we have, I guess, 10 or 15 minutes to ask questions. I don't want to put Travis on the spot, but I noticed that Travis Kincaid had his hand up earlier in the talk, and I wondered if you had a question. I certainly didn't want to ignore it. Okay. Well, if you do, you can put it into the chat and we could read it. That'd be perfectly fine.
Hey, Matt, we have
Um,
a question in the Q&A.
oh, okay. Let me see. Sorry, it doesn't always pop. This is from Kim Stahl. Question for Raquel. Have you considered using any AI tools to analyze the oral histories to perhaps expand the analysis you're able to do? If so, what ethical considerations have you applied or actions have you taken to use those tools in ways that minimize harm? Hmm.
I don't, I try to avoid AI as much as possible. And I think the only way that it gets used is in the transcription of the interviews. And so I'm not using AI to analyze the interviews. Part of what I am doing in order to like increase the sort of like scope and depth of what I am talking about, I think I'm going for depth instead of, I think, breadth and scope. And so something that will be really important for me is like in whatever I write, making sure that I am incorporating as much of the like actual voices of participants as possible. And so creating lots of embedding lots of quotes, honoring the participants themselves as knowledge producers in their own right. Um, and that feels more important, like, like going deep and really honoring participants as knowledge producers in their own right feels more important to me than getting like being able to like analyze everything perfectly, or I'm okay with missing a couple pieces of it if it means that the things that I go into I honor well. But thank you for that question.
Just sort of expanding upon that slightly, Raquel, um, could you maybe explain the afterlife that you have planned for with oral histories? When you sort of alluded to earlier the Black agrarian soul, I was thinking about how much of that must be based on, well, a text doesn't represent the way that people really
Mm-hmm.
speak. And
Mm-hmm.
just so much would be embodied in the emotion, the cadences that people so I was wondering about that.
Yeah, well, I would love to house them at the Southern Oral History program, but I gotta talk to someone over there. I could also see this being some other type of like public facing project. I feel really called to the idea of like turning this into a podcast or something so that it's very easily accessible, without folks having to know about the ins and out of like this one particular archive at UNC, or the Southern Oral History program. But I do think there's something really important about folks being able to hear and see folks. And so I'm thinking about that. First, we gotta get this dissertation done.
Yeah, I, I just wanted people, you had started, both of you were talking earlier about the neophytes and not everybody uses this material, nor should people sort of have an innate notion of what it is.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking that things that you're creating often have extra lives that allow people to imagine the historical lives of. Anyway, it,
Yeah.
it it won't just sort of disappear. Um,
Speaking of that, I have a question for Waqia,
oh,
which is I really like what you were saying about your methodological contribution of archives as mucklands. I'm curious about what does marronage look like in the mucklands? Is that something that's possible, or are there like other third spaces that we need to go to in order to sort of like truly capture some of these narratives? Like, what if this is a muckland? We know that a lot of our enslaved folks practice marronage in the swamps. So if that's the metaphor, what's marronage look like in this?
That's a good question. I also have a question for you, but I mean that's the thing, right? You just basically answered your question. Marronage did take place in swamps, which is what muck is, right? Actually, the term that term muck flood, like it's me also drawing on Zora Neale Hurston, her work, her anthropological work, ethnographic work, and specifically like looking at Black life in mucklands, both during enslavement times and then sort of like post Reconstruction era. It's life in the mucks. It's for me, it's not a metaphor. Like it is a metaphor, but I'm also actually trying to kind of sit with mucklands as an ecosystem. And this is actually my question to you. I'll answer your question, but one of the questions I had for you was, how are you also thinking about, you talk a lot about sort of how Black life is sort of shaping land, and I'm curious if you're also thinking about how land shapes Black life. But for me, I think that needs to, I think in general and the work we do, and especially sort of like in the field of like Black ecologies, we have to kind of really take serious the question of more than human in the landscape. So like when you ask that question of like, what is marronage in mucklands in the swamps, it's brutal, it's hostile. It's also adaptive, right? But you know, the mucklands or the swamps, and you know, the Great Dismal Swamp being one of the kind of largest swamps in which enslaved people inhabited. These were not friendly spaces, right? They were spaces where, you know, you had to navigate, right? Diseases from mosquitoes. You had to navigate crocodiles, sorry, not crocodiles, alligators, all kinds of poisonous snakes. It's also not really, it's not really a space where one can sort of build permanent, like a permanent structure. There are stories, like I've read from some historian stories about people living in the mucklands where they literally built underneath the soil, like in the mud itself. And so there's stories of like enslaved people, Maroons who, for instance, developed things like rickets because they didn't get enough light because they were living underneath. And then there's also stories of people sometimes sort of living up in the kind of like the cypress trees. Yeah, so I think, I mean, for me, that's sort of what I'm getting at when I talk about ecological dispossession is like, I'm talking about the kind of way in which environments and Black people in relationship to environments there's a kind of like, because you're getting both enslaved people being put in the service of transforming environments. In the case of the South Carolina Lowcountry, it's enslaved people having to kind of transform swamplands into marshlands for agricultural use. But then you also have these instances of both enslaved people kind of dying as a result of that work, but also then as they escape plantation life, being pushed into these incredibly hostile environments.
To answer your question in one sentence, this summer I'm focusing my ethnography specifically on the question, how will the land speak in my dissertation? Specifically.
Can you talk more about, I'm curious, can you talk more about it?
No, because the only thing I'm doing is right now I am thinking about how will the land speak in my dissertation in order to plan what that'll look like over the summer. And so I'm just saying, like, that is also a question I'm thinking about. And this summer will be some intentional ethnography based on that question. But it's March. We gonna get there.
It is hard to remember. It is just March. One of the phrases that you used, Waqia, that I was really interested in when you were talking about plantation ledgers, especially was the fantastical nature of them. Um, and I was wondering, I didn't look at your account before we came here, but there is a set of books that I don't know if we ever shared with you named J. Hamilton Cooper papers. He may, and I can I'm put a note to myself. We have digitized versions. He might be a little. Are you edging into Georgia or are you all in? Oh, you're
I am edging into Georgia, but I'm really trying to stick with the Lowcountry because I'm kind of trying to do similar to like what Raquel was saying. I'm really doing these sort of case studies. So like
yeah,
kind of doing like I'm not really doing a historical project. I'm sort of kind of like landing on these particular moments in time and then going deep.
yeah.
Um, and so that just kind of the project gets too large. But I would love to like look at
I
some.
will share these with you. The other thought that I was thinking about is I don't know if this is the right way to articulate it. So when you're talking about this particular instance of racial capitalism, it's it's very English, right? It's like so like when you looked at Eliot and Gonzalez, you saw some of their properties right earlier on were in the Caribbean, which is a different I think it was a different cultural sphere. I don't think it was like Jamaica. And I'm wondering, do you think, despite that sort of political culture differences, the idea of looking at structures of science, structures of sort of legal structures, do you think that that works in other plantation economies, that are, I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I'm not doing a comparative study, so it really is about
no.
the kind of like Anglo. I mean, it's very specific to South Carolina. The plantation economy in the North was even different from what we get.
Mhm.
Even in Virginia to South Carolina, it's very different. But I will say that there are ways in which, in terms of like the kind of ideology being produced, right, the discourse being produced, that extends beyond just the kind of the geographical site, right? So like this
Mhm.
summer, I'm going to be in Paris, and I'm looking at, I'm going to I'll be at the Natural History Museum. They're looking at their archives because
Oh.
some of their papers, I'm forgetting the scientist's name right now. One of the natural scientists who's French was doing research, botanical research in South Carolina, right? So you're seeing that exchange from
Mhm.
like the Americas to back to
Mhm.
Europe, whether we're talking about France or the UK or even like the Dutch colony, the Netherlands as well. A lot of these botanists and the natural scientists that I'm looking at in South Carolina region were also very interested. Like there was a lot of communication back and forth between the Royal Society because they were using
Oh.
the Linnaeus system.
Mhm.
Um, so certainly, yeah, there is. I
Interesting.
think there's ways in which kind of goes beyond just the geographical sites that I'm looking at.
Right. Um, the other thing that I was thinking about, especially in I guess the fourth part of your talk, when you were talking about the commemorative nature of an archive, when you were talking about lineages of planters, one of the things, and I think, yes, I think that there is a lot in the work that speaks to that. Um, the Southern Historical Collection. And then I wish we had had this conversation when you were here, but maybe you're going to come back, you said. There's also something called Memorial Hall that I didn't go to school here as an undergraduate, so I wasn't aware of these. But Memorial Hall, the first time I went there to see actually, it was Audra McDonald singing. They have these plaques, and these plaques basically almost run exactly in parallel with the collections. I was just standing there going, oh, we have their papers and their papers and their papers. And this was also the time when we were constructing. Um, there was a monument on the green, sort of north of us, called the Confederate Memorial. So there was this sort of this triptych that was sort of working in a very political culture, a white supremacist political cultural direction that I think the Southern was clearly a part of. And the problem that I think we have as archivists is one of having such large collections, and it's not a question. I mean, you're talking. It's not a question of just sort of adding words. Um, there's a real structural problem. It often, right, like the Elliott and Gonzalez papers is a triumphalist narrative of construction um, by the Elliots and Gonzalezes that ignores almost everything else. So anyway, it's really interesting. I fear we're at time.